Hello. So what I'm going to do here is go through the 3D texturing process, mainly through Maya, but this could go really with almost any kind of program. And I'm going to go through this in sort of two parts. So the first part will be sort of just a general overview of just materials, texturing, UVs, all that fun stuff. In the second part, I'm going to go through more specific stuff on how to deal with UVs. So if for some reason you want to get to the UV part, that'll be in sort of the second video, and I'll go through more of the general stuff in this first video. It can get a little bit complicated, which is why I've sort of broken this up. So that's why, so we'll sort of just go through the general stuff to begin with. So hopefully that makes sense. So to get started, let's talk about how sort of the 3D texturing process works. So we normally have a 3D model. So we'll have a 3D model of some sort. Maybe my little cube drawing. Okay, so we could have a box or a sphere. This is going to connect to what's called UVs. This is just sort of a general drawing of what UVs might look like. UVs are sort of a in-between layer between our 3D model. These are our UVs. After our UVs, and I'll sort of go into more depth in this in a second, we'll have our texture. And then from there, come around. Oops, actually, you know. After our texture, once we have a texture, we'll usually apply that to a material. So this is just going to be our material symbol here. Okay. And then our material will feed back into a textured 3D model, an object. So from here we'll have sort of our textured. So, one of the ways I usually like to sort of explain this is if we pull up an image of an orange here, pulling up an image of an orange. Our 3D objects are going to be a lot like an orange. We even think of the sphere as maybe an orange. When you have an orange, it has that layer of skin around it. So we've got this this layer of orange skin around here, around the orange. And that's a bit like our texture for the orange. In terms of our 3D model, that orange skin, that would sort of be this texture. But in order to get to that, we need to set up some UVs. So UVs are this in-between layer between our 3D model and our texture. And it's sort of how the computer will represent and allow us to put a texture on a 3D model. As a sort of reference point, because it's kind of bit abstract. And some of these images are by Jeff Parrott, Jeff at environmentartist.com, really good artist, environment artist. So if we look here, we see just a basic cube. And on here on the right are textures, or UVs, laid out. Pull up maybe another example here. We'll refer to this image. So here on the right is what our UVs will actually look like in Maya. And this might seem really complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on right here, but we'll sort of break this down and make this all make sense over time. So we have a cube here on the left, and we have some UVs on the right. So they'll look sort of like these blue shells. We'll make them look blue. Or they'll look like these white lines. And inside those white lines is where we can put our texture. So we're gonna, in part 2 of this, we'll sort of really get into how to lay out these UVs and make them really nice. We're gonna start here now, but this can get a little complicated for first-timers, for beginners. So that's why we'll have a second part of this to get better at laying these things out, especially for more complicated objects. But for now, we can sort of get an idea of what they look like just by sort of looking at this and seeing this layout of UVs. Here's sort of another example of like a layout of a UV with some texture on it. And let me actually I'll pull up one more and we'll sort of see the sort of the raw bits of what this is going to look like. Whoop. There we go. So here's another example of what some UVs might look like. All the lines represent sort of the wireframe. There are edges on our model. And here's an example of what that would look like textured. Oops, we'll make it big. Here's that same thing textured. So there's that. Now, let's see. I can sort of show maybe what that looks like when that's finished. So, we'll go back here, and I'm just going to pull up a screenshot of what that can look like. So here's maybe a small example. There's that textured asset. It is in Unity, in game. So we have the model, we generate some UVs, we texture them, and then there's the in-between step of the material, Let's see if I had a couple more images of it. There's a little bit there. Here it is sort of again from a different angle. Let's see. Here's sort of another just view of that. So going back here, that should give you hopefully like a decent preview of what the UVs are. They're basically how Maya or any 3D modeling program is interpreting the 3D model. It's flattening it and allowing us to turn it into a texture. So to go back to sort of our orange example, this orange skin, we'll have to like peel a part of it off. We'll have to peel the back of it and sort of lay it flat if we want to turn it into that a 2D texture. And this is the part where we're laying it flat so that we can texture it. Once we have the texture, that texture is going to go into something called a material. So I'm going to pull up sort of an example right now of a material. The material can take a number of textures, so that's why we have sort of a multitude of boxes here. And those textures might apply to, we'll see it in a second here as this pulls up. There we go. Oh, maybe I should pull it up locally. Sorry, this is taking a bit. Alright, we'll close that. Here we go. I found it locally. So here's sort of an example of a material down here. And this is so here's a model. I've got wireframe. Here's some of the textures for it. And here's the material. So this is an example of, in this case, UDK or Unreal Engine 4 material. Like I said, it can take multiple textures. So over here we have an example of diffuse. This blue one is an example of a normal map. This is the specular map. This determines how much it shines. The normal map gives it a bit more detail. So some of these like grooves in the tire, they're not in the actual wireframe of the tire, but they'll look like they're in there a little bit, and they will reflect light because they're in a normal map. So that's what the normal map can do. It can make things look like they have a little more detail, like there's maybe some more cuts in there, but they're not actually in there. And the specular map will determine how shiny that stuff's going to be and what color it might shine. This next one is a glow map, or an emissions map. So this can sort of determine how things will glow or emit. So in this case, like the console is supposed to glow a little bit. So it's not glowing a whole lot, but there should be a little shine to that, or bloom. If we add a bloom post-process effect. Some of these are adding for reflection, and this one on the right is sort of a reflection map of what will reflect on this bike. So all of these combine to form a material, and you'll have a material either inside of Maya, but you'll have one inside of Maya and inside of a game engine. So that will sort of hook up, and that will feed back into our textured that will feed back into our textured 3D object. So we'll put the material onto our object, and then we will see it textured. So that's sort of the general layout of the 3D texturing process. As sort of maybe just a note to that, a general sort of thinking to some of this. We go back to some of Jeff's boxes. One thing I sort of like to point out is that, you know, although you may be looking at getting into 3D modeling, the texturing process, the texturing portion of this is super important. Because, and the way I sort of break it down is this, we'll make a new layer here, is to have sort of 1/3 of the time you're spending on say a model, or just any asset that you're trying to make look good, 1/3 to spend on the model. So if you're making a box or any kind of asset, spend 1/3 on the model, 1/3 texturing, and then 1/3 lighting. As a good sort of general rule, and to sort of break down how you're spending your time. Because each of these things will play an equal part in how your asset looks and comes together. And it can be really difficult when you're just starting, because you might not have a lot of experience in terms of how things will sort of show up. So another part of this is getting from A to B as fast as possible, meaning getting from a 3D model to having something textured as fast as you can, and then iterating on that process to see how it's going to look, because you might not have a ton of experience yet. So you want to spend, so just to reiterate again, spend like 1/3 of time on your model if you can. Not every little tidbit that you spend modeling will really come out and be super visible. It might not make a huge difference in the end, which is why I pointed out. And sort of close some of this here. If we go back to Jeff's boxes, we can sort of see that illustrated, because we have just a plain box. But he textured it really nicely. And so it's hard to actually even tell that this is just a standard cube. So that's why texturing is really important. It can add just a ton of depth, a ton of like look and feel to something, and you don't always have to put a ton of time into the model to get a good result at the end, if you can do good texturing. So 1/3 modeling, 1/3 texturing, and 1/3 lighting. Lighting will sort of come later, but lighting is also really important. If it's hard to see parts of the model because it's too dark, or for whatever the case may be, our stuff won't look as good. Even here we can sort of see like a shadow on the side of this cube. It's not a super dark shadow. We don't have jet black. So all of these things play an equal sort of part in this process. So now that we've sort of got maybe a sort of generic idea here for some of this stuff, let's maybe go back into Maya. Whoops. I'm going to put some of these notes over here for later. Let me add to this. Okay, so let's go into Maya here. We'll open up the new one. Maya 2014 and Maya 2016 do differ. Maya's been improving some of its tools, so some of these will change up a little bit, but the generic process is still sort of the same. So here we've got a cube, And I believe we covered this in the last sort of set of videos, but just to go over it again, 4 will show wireframe, 5 will show a shaded view, and 6 will show our texture. We don't have a texture on here yet, so we're not seeing anything. So let's maybe get that started and sort of see what some of that looks like. In order to do that, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to create a material. And I should have a little doc here that I will pull up to sort of help with some of this. Whoop, wrong doc. So here's that doc. First step, apply material. So in Maya, I'm just going to right click and hold, and I'll just say assign a new material. So right away we're getting what material do you want to assign. So let's come back over here, let's check out our doc. We generally have 3 choices: Lamberts, Fongs, and blends. Lamberts are for objects sort of without normal maps or shine or gloss. If you're going to have something that's going to have shine or gloss, you probably want to go with a Fong or a blend. We're just starting out, so for our purposes right now, a Lambert is going to be fine. In terms of maybe game references, Lamberts would probably be something we might see on like the older Zelda games, or a lot of things from Nintendo. Newer ones, we're probably going to use maybe like Fongs or blends. They're going to have a lot of normal maps. Modern day, that's 2015, so like modern day Western and sort of Japanese games. We're actually also getting into a point sort of now where we have a standard shader with physically based rendering where some of this stuff is going to be sort of built in. We might not see this in our game object, but this will still exist in sort of Maya. That's getting a little advanced for right now. So for now, we'll just click Lambert. Over here, we've got our material attributes. So up here, it's going to be the second one from the right, third one from the left. We've got our attribute editor. You can see it's a Lambert, and we've got some generic things we can sort of put in here. One of which is color. So we want to put some sort of color in here to be able to sort of see it on this box. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put a file in here. So I'm going to click this checker box, and I'm going to go File, and I'm going to browse for a UV checker. That's going to allow me to see, it's going to give me an idea of where my UVs are and how they're displayed. Now I got this just by going to Google, and we can just type UV checker, and we've got a ton of them here. So they're super easy to find, and you can just download one really easily. So I've got my UV checker on, but we're not seeing it. So again, 4 wireframe, 5 shaded, 6 for textured view. And there we go, now we can see our UV checker on there. The other next important sort of part of this is being able to view our UVs. So we need to view our UV editor. The really nice way of doing this is over here on the left, where we have different views or different view presets in Maya. We're going to right click one of these, and this one I've already got set up, but we're going to right click this if you don't have it set up and just say Perspective UV Editor. So I'm going to click that now, and that gives us this layout. So now this image on our right is this editor is our perspective UV texture editor, or just UV texture editor. It's sort of hard to see our UVs right now, so let's click a couple of buttons here to start out to make this a little bit easier. First one I'm going to click is this blue icon, which will toggle shaded UV display. So we're going to click that. That's going to make our UV shells turn blue and make them a little bit easier to see. The next one we'll hit is sort of display alpha channel. We might actually even be able to just turn off texturing there. Dim image on or off. So these will sort of help us to be able to see it. And you may be asking what does UV mean? Like, why is that? The reason is sort of simple, actually. I Googled it on Wikipedia and read about it on Wikipedia recently. So it's just because we're using X, Y, and Z to display our 3D coordinates in here. So the next ones are just U and V. And they correspond to sort of this, what would be this X and Y axis, but we're not going to call it X and Y because we're using those inside of our 3D coordinates. But they're going to correspond to this horizontal and vertical axis inside of this UV editor. Another thing about our UVs, they're going to need to fit inside of this 0 to 1 space. So if we look really closely here, we see negative 0.1, that this is going to be 0, 0. This is our 0, 0 point. And if we come up here, you can see 1, 1. Our UVs need to go inside of this 0 to 1 space. Let's pull up. Oops. Let's pull up another example of some UVs. And a lot of the ones I have here come from Dan Pinkston, dan-art.com. Really nice, really good artist. So if we look at some of Dan's UVs here, these are going to fit inside the 0 to 1 space. Anything outside of this 0 to 1 space is going to repeat. Here's that model itself. So if we were making link, we probably wouldn't want things on the link, this dark link, to repeat. An example of something we might want to repeat would be sort of a grass texture. I could maybe pull up a grass texture here quickly. So here's sort of maybe a poor example, but this is an example of something that'll repeat. If I duplicate this on every side, you won't really be able to tell where it ends and where it starts. So that's an example of a sort of a repeating texture. An example of where you might use that is if you had a giant terrain. You don't want to make a giant texture to go along with it, so you make a texture that can repeat and that you can just spread out easily. For certain objects, for certain game assets, we don't want them to repeat. And so for those, we don't want them to leave our 0 to 1 space. And that's why we want to keep it in. So if we take this, just to sort of, illustrate that a little bit. If I pull this above, we can see that even though this is even if we put it completely outside of our 0 to 1 space, we're still getting similar kind of numbers, because our texture is going to repeat outside of here. And if I was to scale this up, we can see it repeating. So there it is repeating. that can sort of bring us maybe a bit to our next point, which is that we can use move, rotate, and scale inside of the UV texture editor, just like we can inside of our viewport, which is really nice and sort of helpful. Same, so we're inside of Maya, so same key commands, W for move, E for rotate, R for scale, all work inside of here. Now, let's maybe go into a bit of sort of example on sort of how some of this works. And this will just be sort of maybe a bit of a preview as far as what we'll get to in the second part of this. So for some of these, UVs, where they have an ending here. So if I go to an edge, we hit F, we can see that this is cutting off. So maybe we'll move it a little bit actually. So we can actually like cut the B off, or C or A, and we can see that that edge right there is cutting off. This edge, as it applies to UV things, we would call a seam. So everywhere that we've got an edge and it's not connecting to another edge is a seam. We can sew some of those seams together. So we've got a seam right there. If we wanted to, we could sew it together. Notice how now it's stretching though. So we have a bit of a game to play here. And that game is, how much do we want to sew things together to remove seams versus how much are we going to deal with stretching? And we have tools that will enable us to minimize stretching, and we're going to also have tools that will enable us to minimize the visibility of seams. But it's something that we're going to want to keep in mind when going through this is, do we want to keep a seam? How many seams do we want? And how much stretching do we want? And how much stretching are we going to allow for? And it's a give and take between these two things. So now that we've sort of gone through that a little bit, let's maybe put a texture on this box and run through some more of this process. So let's pull up our doc again, our UV and texturing process. So the second part of this is creating UVs. Any object that you make will come with a default set of UVs. It'll have something laid out by default, and that's what we're seeing here. This is the default layout for these UVs. I can come up here, if we go to our modeling tab, and I can go to UV, and I have some different tools for how I might want to lay out these UVs to start with. So one way is maybe I could do a planar view, and if you look, you can sort of see this box. This is projecting what our UVs will look like, which looks great for some of these sides, but then we have massive stretching on the middle. We could come in here, we go to UV, we go to planar, we can hit our little options box, which is this box here, and we could switch the axis if we wanted to, but we're going to get a sort of similar result. So we're getting a good result vertically, but sort of a bad result along some of these horizontal faces. We could UV map something plane by plane if we wanted to. And sometimes we'll actually do that by planes or groups of planes. For our purposes now, though, we'll just go through some more of these. So we've got cylindrical, sort of see some of the cylindrical, and we could mess with this if we wanted to. Generally I don't, but we could if we wanted to. Notice we're still getting some stretching on the top, but it looks decent from the midpoint here, from the middle part. We could do spherical, so same sort of result pretty much. The one I tend to go with the most is automatic. Automatic tends to give me about the flattest it can make each face, and it will then attempt to group some of those faces together. In this case, because of this box, it's just separated all of the faces, so it hasn't grouped anything, but it just separated them for us, which is fine. And this is something that we can work with. So in general, one of the things I'll do is we want to start by trying to map our 3D object and just get us as far along as we can to sort of start. And that may mean auto mapping the whole object, and you may just auto map the whole object just to get a view of what you're dealing with, what you're going to be working with. Maybe you got a complex object. From there, you may end up selecting particular faces, and maybe you auto map those individual faces. So maybe we could take a face of this cube and just auto map that. Maybe we could take a group of faces and automatic map it. Maybe we take a group of faces and we cylindrical map it. The point of this sort of process is just to maybe get you as far as you can to making something look nice. This third part, this editing UVs, this is where we have to get sort of into the nitty-gritty of things to make UVs look as nice as some of Dan's UVs here. We're gonna have to get into the nitty-gritty to get as good as Dan. That part we're gonna get into in the second part of this video. So to simplify things, we're going to end up skipping and going to this fourth part, which is building and applying the texture. So we're going to go straight to this part. We actually might even cut out some of the Photoshop part. We'll include that part. That's also more, pretty detailed. So we'll sort of skip some of the intro Photoshop and save that for next time. We just want to get through this process sort of as simply as we can, and then we'll dig in a little deeper next time. So for right now, let's build and apply a texture. And we've actually already enabled and viewed this. So building and applying a texture. So let's go to CG Textures. CG Textures is a really good website. It's got everything. You can see it breaks things down by what they are. Floor, we could go concrete, whatever. If you're looking for a particular material, it's really good. It's usable. I believe it's sort of like open source. You may have to credit them, but you can use this stuff. So let's search for a box and see what we come up with. When you're looking for stuff in here, you generally want to try and find some things with even lighting. And that's one of the great things about CG Textures is it'll give you even lighting. This will sort of require an account, so which I recommend. Creating and sort of setting up. So we just downloaded a texture, or downloading. While that's downloading, let's mention a couple of things about that. When we're using a texture, we're going to want it to be a target or a PNG. If we're going to put it in a game engine, if we're going to use it, we're going to want it to be a target or a PNG. And the reason is these are lossless. So we're not going to lose information within our image due to compression if we use these formats. Notice I just downloaded this texture and it downloaded as a JPEG. It's because JPEGs are really good for the web because they compress, so you can download things faster, but we don't want that. We want the highest quality that we can get. Because we just downloaded a JPEG, that means what we should do, ideally, is throw this into Photoshop or GIMP and edit it, turn it into a target or a PNG, and then export it out and use it. But we're going to cheat a little bit today for simplicity's sake, and we'll just use the JPEG. The other part of this is we generally want to use a power of 2, and this is because game engines like power of 2. So that might mean like a 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048. You probably won't have to go much bigger than that. You know, maybe as the years go on, 4096 by 4096. Some games might use a 32 by a 32. I think Minecraft, all the textures in Minecraft might be 32 by 32. But regardless, we want to make sure it's a power of 2. And also, what I just downloaded, we can look at the resolution here, and we can see it's not a power of 2. It's not even, and it's not going to hit like 1024 by 1024. So this is going to require Photoshop editing to hit the 2 things we needed to hit. But we're going to skip that for today. But in the second part of this, we're going to make sure we correct that, and in the future you're going to want to make sure you adhere to these 2 things. But for now, we'll sort of skip that for simplicity. So what I'm going to do, grab that image, and I'll just throw it on my desktop for now. And I'm going to make a new material right now. I'm going to assign a new material. We'll use a Lambert. And I'm going to hit my checker box over here, and I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to point to this folder icon. We'll go to the desktop, and I'm going to apply that crate. So there it is there. So now what I want to do, let's actually maybe turn the image back on so we can see it. I'm going to retrofit some of my UV shells to fit this image. Again, not necessarily how we would normally do things. We would normally lay out our UV shells and then make our texture adhere to our UV shells. But for simplicity, we're going to sort of cheat and do this backwards. So I'm going to lay these out and adhere them to our texture. So if I right click and hold here, I have the ability to sort of go to edge mode, and I can see where those edges apply to. I can go to face mode. So I have the ability to go to all these things we would be able to go to normally in our viewport. But I have additional stuff like UV. Oops. So I'm going to click UV here. Generally what I do, and maybe with some of the newer Mayas there's a better way, but I sort of still use this. I like this. Is I'm going to go to UV, and I'm just going to select one UV there. And then I'm going to go to the shell for that. So I'm going to control right click right now. So I'm controlling and right clicking, and then I go to the shell. This allows me to grab all of these. The reason I do this is I don't want to come over here and grab some of these and have some of them stretch. So if we go and we find that, we can see that, you know, we don't like stretching. We don't like what it does. And we've just laid everything out with AutoMap so that we can sort of avoid stretching. So I just want to grab one, control right click and go to shell, and move it out of the way. Actually, I can move all these out of the way. I can just marquee select, left click and drag, move all these out of the way. So I'm going to select this, and let's scale it up with R and W to move it a little bit, and that'll get it pretty close. If I go to face mode, I click the face, I can see it right there. There it is on there. Looking okay, you know, it's not AAA, but it's a good start if you're just starting. So let's take another one. We'll sort of scale this one up. Back to sort of grabbing these individual ones. So I'm on UV, right clicking and holding, going to UV, left click to just grab a corner, just like it was a vert, and then I'm control right clicking and going to shell. W to move, R to scale, and then W to move, R to scale. Back over here, selecting a corner, control right click to shell. There's some other ways to get to the shell. I find this to be sort of the fastest. It is sort of a pain at first to learn control right click, but once you just commit that to memory, things go a lot faster. One of the other ways is we could just right click and hold and say select shell. We sort of gotta wait for the pop up. It's not quite as fast, and you end up sort of having to grab it a lot to try and grab a shell. So it's worth committing that control right click to memory. Cool. So we've got our box. There's our box. It's not gonna win us any awards, but it's a good start for getting started and learning this process. Again, we skipped a few things. We did some things we wouldn't normally do, but we did it with the intention of just sort of getting started, making something simple to begin with. So, you know, we skipped making it a target or a PNG. We skipped making it a power of 2. Normally, we'd make a UV snapshot, and we'd send that out to Photoshop, and we'd make our texture adhere to our UVs as opposed to vice versa. But we've got it applied now. And we've got 6 in the viewport, so that pretty much covers the basics of the first part of this, which is just learning how to get your texture in, and how to view it, and how to manipulate some of these UVs. For the second part of this, try doing this on a barrel. So I'm just going to make a little barrel here. And you don't have to lay it out like I do or anything like that. But try setting up a barrel. So if we run through this right now, we'll go back to our process, and we'll go through this. First thing we want to do is apply that material. So I'm gonna I could make a new material, or I could apply an existing material. I actually probably should have named this. So M_UV checker. this up again. We're going to put a material on it. We're going to lay out some of these UVs. So we're going to auto map this and we'll just see what we get. So we get this. This is what we get when we just auto map it. Notice we've got some separation here, which means we've got some seams. We're going to have at least one seam here. We're going to need at least one seam going around this. If I was to move and sew all these pieces, we'll still have at least one seam. We'll get that if we try and connect them. You're probably like, well, does that move and sew? But we're going to get to that later. So we know that this isn't going to quite work for us. So what we can do, as maybe an example to sort of show some of these other methods of mapping, I'm going to come over here in my perspective view. I'm going to go to face mode, and I'm just going to select the mid part of this barrel. I'm going to go to UV, and I'm going to cylindrical map that. And get this, which looks pretty nice, pretty nicely laid out. So I'm going to right click and go to UV over here in my UV texture editor because it's outside of my 0 to 1 space. I'm going to control right click to go to shell, and I'm going to pull it back into that 0 to 1 space using scale. Now let's pretend that the top, these two shells aren't quite laid out the way that we want. We could select their faces as well. We could select them in our perspective viewport, or we could select them inside of our UV viewport. And I'm going to planar map those, but I'm going to go to my options here. Now if I planar map them from the Z-axis, that's not helping at all. But I can planar map them from Y, and we can get a nice layout for them. I'm going to go to UV mode, select both, control right click to go to shell, and move them out of the way a little bit. Maybe I'll even scale them down. It's good to have our numbers and letters be about the same size in general. Maybe for a character you would want to have a character's face be bigger so you get a higher resolution. For our purposes now, we want to just keep it generally the same size. Notice this is also showing purple. It's because I have this top UV shell and this bottom UV shell on top of one another. If I go to the shell here, we can see one of them is actually red. The reason this is red is it means this is upside down. Because I planar mapped it, it read it as if it was inside of here. So read it looking down, but that would be sort of the inside of the object. So we need to flip this. So I'm going to go polygons, flip, and now we can see it's blue. We could, if we wanted to, still lay this on top of this. We could do that. And then we would only have to texture, sort of a bad, get that a little closer. We could do that, and we could lay this out inside of here, and we could just make one barrel top. The problem with that is if we wanted to have changes in the top of the barrel as opposed to the bottom of the barrel, we couldn't do that. Anything we made to the top would show up on the bottom. So if this is going to be an oil can with like a little opening here, in this current configuration, we would have that on the bottom. So if we want a little sort of asymmetry or a difference here, we're going to have to separate them. But you can overlap stuff if you want. If you want to try and get a better resolution for things. If you want to conserve space and have something bigger in your texture so that it has a little more resolution and looks nice. So for here, let's see here. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to pull up a bit of a barrel texture, just so we can sort of get an idea and understanding of how this works. Again, you know, if we were to use a barrel texture here, if we use this person's barrel texture, this is sort of like, this is essentially this is sort of like plagiarism, basically. You don't want to use someone's texture, especially without modifying it. For the purposes of what we're doing now, we're just sort of going to use it to learn how all this is working. But you don't want to just download someone's texture and use it. It differs in CG textures, you know, because we're downloading sort of these stock images, and in general, you're actually going to probably end up modifying them to some degree. You may end up modifying them because your UV shells require you to. You know, we could go back to CG textures and we could lay out a side of a barrel and two tops of a barrel. But I want to avoid getting into Photoshop yet, because that's going to be another 45 minutes of explaining. So for right now, we're just going to use a different texture, but again, like, you don't want to do this. This would be plagiarism, and we don't want to do that. It's okay to use the source, but not someone's sort of created texture. And usually, even if you're using a source texture from CG textures, you want to paint over it, add to it, add variation, whatever it is. You know, you want to customize it and make it a little nice. It's usually not 100% of the way there. But for our purposes, now we just want to sort of see how this process works. So we just pull up a barrel texture, and there's a number of them we could sort of use. So we've got a barrel. I'm going to go to my UV mode, and these aren't quite lining up, so I'm going to line them up a little bit. And we'll take this, looks like this is going to apply to our top, so we'll put this towards the top of this barrel. Could even stretch it a bit if we wanted. And we'll put this one towards the bottom. Whoops. And that'll sort of give you an example, just to see and understand how this process works. It's a little sort of exercise just to make a simple asset and understand how this process works. If we look closely, we can see, you know, we still have that seam in there. You know, we could try and maybe get this a little closer. We could expand this, get it a little closer. But regardless of what we do, unless we sort of paint it out in the texture, we're probably going to have a little bit of a seam there to deal with. So that's that. Just a few other things I wanted to point out. If you want to take a look at all your materials inside of Maya, we can go Window, Rendering Editor, Hypershade. This will allow us to see the materials we've created so far. So we've got a UV checker, Lambert. It looks like I may have put that barrel on the UV checker, which I shouldn't have done. But we've got our box here. And we could create some more if we wanted to. The reason I sort of point this out and show this is that you know, you don't need to always make a new material every time you want to check out your texture. You can go back to existing materials. Sometimes people end up making a number of materials, and it's not like they just make duplicate materials constantly, and it's just not necessary. You can go to the hypershade and you can delete those or reuse existing ones. To reuse an existing one, we can just control right click and assign an existing material. The other part of this is that you don't want to edit your Lambert 1 material. If I was to say, maybe we'll give our Lambert 1 a blue color. Now every time I create a new object, it's going to be blue. Because the way Maya works is it's always going to assign a material, a default material. And that default material is Lambert 1. So if you edit Lambert 1, you're going to be editing every subsequent material for something that you create, or anything in your scene that may also be Lambert 1. So make sure when you're doing this, you do make a new material. You know, that's why we have the first part of this, is sort of making and applying a new material, or using an existing one. So that'll sort of, I guess, wrap up the first part of this. You know, if you're following along with this, try and make the box in the barrel and see how you do. I'll go into the second part of this, and we'll go into some more of the manipulating UVs and going into Photoshop and sort of learning more of the guts of how to do this the right way. So hopefully this is helpful for everyone. And if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. Let's see. This is my website. If you want to tell me I shouldn't be doing something, or you like something, whatever the case may be, you can come here, shoot me an email, contact me. Cool? Alright. I'll see you guys next time.